A successful black CEO travels to a small town for business, only to become the target of a corrupt sheriff fueled by deep-seated racism. What starts as a simple visit spirals into a nightmare when he is falsely accused and framed for crimes he didn't commit. The sheriff manipulates the system, using his authority to exploit racial biases and silence the protagonist. As the CEO navigates public humiliation and systemic prejudice, the story exposes the infuriating reality of racism in America, leaving viewers outraged at the abuse of power and the injustices faced by those who challenge the status quo. Dr. Isaiah Bennett adjusted his glasses and glanced at the weathered clock hanging on the wall of Pete's diner. It was just shy of 8 p.m. And the place buzzed with a quiet energy, the scrape of forks against plates, the low hum of conversation, and the hiss of the grill. As an apron-clad cook worked diligently behind the counter, Isaiah shifted in the vinyl booth, the faint creak of the seat barely audible over the din. Despite being one of the most celebrated heart surgeons in the region, and a tireless advocate for healthcare equity, tonight, he was just another patron in a small-town diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had grown lukewarm. His tailored charcoal suit and polished Oxfords contrasted with the more casual flannel shirts and jeans that populated the room, but Isaiah didn't mind. He had always preferred modest settings like this, places where the food was honest, the people were straightforward, and the weight of his accolades didn't follow him like a shadow. The modesty of the diner reminded him of his upbringing, far from the spotlight and closer to the struggles he now worked to address. A gentle breeze from the front door's occasional opening carried the scent of fried onions and rain-soaked asphalt. Outside, the neon sign that declared Pete's flickered sporadically, casting a faint glow over the cracked pavement of the parking lot. The town of Millbrook was quiet tonight, its streets damp from an earlier downpour, and its residents retreating into their homes or gathering in familiar spots like this. Isaiah glanced at his phone, which buzzed intermittently with emails and messages. He silenced it with a swipe, unwilling to let work intrude on this brief moment of solitude. His attention shifted to a young waitress balancing a tray of plates as she navigated between tables, her movements practiced but hurried. When she approached, her expression was warm, but tinged with exhaustion. "Refill, Doc?" she asked, her voice bright enough to cut through his introspection. Isaiah smiled. "Sure, Clara. But only if you promise to take a break soon." She grinned, her cheeks flushing. "I'll pencil it in." "You're not here for one of Pete's pies tonight?" "Maybe next time," he replied, watching her pour fresh coffee into his mug. "Thanks." As Clara moved away, Isaiah's eyes drifted across the diner. Most patrons paid him no mind, but there were exceptions. A group of men at the far corner table, locals by the look of them, had been sneaking glances his way since he walked in. Their conversation was low, punctuated by the occasional chuckle, but their stares carried an edge that Isaiah recognized all too well. He took a sip of his coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had drawn this kind of attention, and it wouldn't be the last. Millbrook, like many small towns, had its own rhythms and its own prejudices, and while Isaiah's name carried weight in boardrooms and hospitals, here, he was simply another unfamiliar face, one that didn't quite fit the expectations of the men in the corner. "Big city type," one of them muttered, loud enough to carry another man, broad-shouldered and wearing a ball cap, smirked, but said nothing. Isaiah remained calm, his gaze steady as he turned back to his coffee. Engaging would accomplish nothing. He had learned that long ago. Still, the tension lingered, unspoken but palpable. The door chimed as a new customer entered, a middle-aged man in a sheriff's uniform. Sheriff Daniels. Isaiah recognized him immediately, not from any personal encounter, but from stories and whispers around town. Daniels was a fixture in Millbrook, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and an approach to law enforcement that some described as strict and others as unforgiving. Daniels surveyed the room with practiced ease, his sharp eyes landing briefly on Isaiah before moving on. The sheriff exchanged a nod with the men in the corner before making his way to the counter. He leaned against it, striking up a conversation with the cook, his voice carrying just enough to suggest he wanted to be overheard. "Quiet night," Daniels said, his tone casual. "Heard some city folk are sniffing around town lately, always makes things interesting." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't look up. He reached for his mug, letting the warmth ground him as the sheriff's words hung in the air. Clara returned to his table, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "You okay, Doc?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He met her gaze and smiled reassuringly. "I'm fine, Clara. Don't worry about me." But she did worry. Isaiah could see it, in the way she glanced over her shoulder at Daniels and the men in the corner, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tray. As the minutes stretched on, Isaiah's presence seemed to draw more attention, the subtle tension in the room coiling tighter. It wasn't overt hostility, at least not yet, but it was enough to remind him of the quiet battles he fought every day. Here, his title, his achievements, his reputation, they meant nothing. In this diner, he was simply a black man in a tailored suit, and that alone was enough to unsettle some. The simmering atmosphere reached a low boil when Daniels turned from the counter and approached Isaiah's table. His expression was neutral, but there was a challenge in his eyes, a quiet demand for deference. "Evening," Daniels said, his voice measured. "Haven't seen you around here before." Isaiah looked up, his demeanor calm but firm. "Evening, Sheriff, just grabbing a cup of coffee." Daniels nodded slowly, his gaze flicking to the empty plate and back. "Noticed your car out front, nice ride, don't see many like that around here." "It gets me where I need to go," Isaiah replied, keeping his tone even. The sheriff lingered, as if waiting for something more. When Isaiah offered nothing, Daniels tilted his head slightly, his smile tight. "Well, enjoy your coffee, let us know if you need anything." Isaiah gave a polite nod, watching as the sheriff returned to the counter. The exchange was brief, almost innocuous, but the tension it left in its wake was unmistakable. Clara approached once more, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry about that, Doc Daniels. He can be—" "It's all right," Isaiah interrupted gently. "I've dealt with worse." Her frown deepened, but she didn't press further. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Isaiah alone with his thoughts. The men in the corner resumed their quiet conversation, but their glances lingered. Daniels stayed by the counter, his presence a silent reminder of the unspoken rules that governed places like this. And Isaiah, for all his accomplishments and all his resilience, found himself once again navigating a world that seemed determined to remind him of its prejudices. As the clock ticked past 8:30, Isaiah finished his coffee and reached for his wallet. He left a generous tip on the table, more than Clara would expect, and stood to leave. The hum of the diner seemed to pause as he made his way to the door, every movement measured and deliberate. Outside, the air was cool and damp, the faint scent of rain still lingering. Isaiah paused on the sidewalk, glancing back at the diner's glowing windows. He had come here for a quiet moment, a brief respite from the demands of his work, but he had found something else. A reminder that the battles he fought in operating rooms and boardrooms were only one front in a much larger war. As he stepped into his car and started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was only the beginning. Something had shifted in Millbrook, and Isaiah had a sinking suspicion that his presence in this town had drawn attention he couldn't yet fully understand. Dr. Isaiah Bennett sat in his car for a moment longer than necessary, gripping the steering wheel as the distant hum of the diner still buzzed in his mind. The encounter with Sheriff Daniels wasn't his first brush with veiled prejudice, but it stung in its predictability. He drew a deep breath and let it out slowly, releasing the tension that had coiled in his shoulders. This wasn't new, he reminded himself. He'd been navigating these waters for as long as he could remember. Yet, familiarity didn't dull the sting, it only sharpened his awareness of its inevitability. With the rain starting to mist again, Isaiah turned the ignition and eased the car into Millbrook's quiet streets. His destination was the town's community center, where he planned to meet with the organizers of a new health initiative aimed at providing care for underserved populations in the area. The project was personal for him. His foundation had funded mobile clinics in similar towns, and he was determined to bring the same level of care to Millbrook despite the challenges. The community center was a modest building, its faded brick exterior and flickering fluorescent lights standing as a testament to years of underfunding. Isaiah parked and grabbed his briefcase, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked asphalt as he approached the entrance. Inside, the air was slightly stale, the faint scent of old books and cleaning supplies mingling with the warmth of bodies gathered in the meeting room. As he stepped inside, conversations quieted. The handful of attendees, mostly older white residents, turned their heads in unison to look at him. Isaiah felt the weight of their gazes, but smiled politely as he approached the makeshift podium at the front of the room. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady and warm. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Dr. Isaiah Bennett, and I'm here to discuss the new healthcare initiative we're working to bring to Millbrook." A murmur rippled through the room, more of a hum than outright engagement. Isaiah launched into his presentation, outlining the benefits of the program with precision and enthusiasm. He spoke of the mobile clinics, staffed with top-tier professionals who could provide everything from routine checkups to urgent care. He explained how the initiative would prioritize accessibility, offering services on a sliding scale to ensure no one was turned away. Despite his passion, the room remained largely unmoved. A man in his 60s with a weathered face and a cap advertising a local feed store raised his hand. "This all sounds nice, Doc," the man said, his tone laced with skepticism. "But what's the catch? You're saying this is all funded by some big city folks who don't even live here?" Isaiah met his gaze evenly. "There's no catch, sir. The funding comes from a combination of state grants and private donations. My team and I have been working on similar projects across the state, and we've seen real success in improving healthcare access." The man scoffed, crossing his arms. "Sounds to me like you're just here to make a name for yourself coming into our town, telling us how to fix things." Before Isaiah could respond, a woman near the back chimed in. "We don't need outsiders telling us what to do. We've been fine on our own." Isaiah suppressed the urge to sigh. This wasn't the first time he'd faced resistance, but the palpable hostility in the room felt different. He kept his tone calm and professional, even as frustration gnawed at him. "I understand your concerns," he said, his voice steady. "But the goal here isn't to impose anything. This initiative is about providing resources to those who need them most. It's about saving lives." A ripple of uneasy silence followed, broken only by the creak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. From the corner of his eye, Isaiah noticed Sheriff Daniels enter the room. His broad frame filled the doorway, and his mere presence seemed to embolden the skeptics in the audience. Daniels didn't say anything, but his arms were crossed, and his gaze fixed squarely on Isaiah. The tension thickened as another voice cut through the quiet, a younger man this time, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt. "You got any proof this program of yours actually works? Or is this just another way to take our tax dollars and give it to people who don't deserve it?" Isaiah's chest tightened. The implication was clear, and it wasn't the first time he'd heard it. He fought the urge to respond with anything other than measured professionalism. "All our programs are audited and evaluated by independent organizations," he explained. "I'd be happy to provide you with the data showing the success rates in similar communities." The man smirked but said nothing, his arms folded as he leaned back in his chair. Daniels, still silent, stepped further into the room, his boots echoing against the linoleum floor. He stopped near the side wall, just close enough to make his presence felt. The meeting dragged on, with Isaiah fielding increasingly pointed questions that had little to do with the initiative and everything to do with his presence in their town. His patience wore thin, but he refused to let it show. He answered each question with precision, deflecting the hostility without feeding into it. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, anger simmered. As the meeting wrapped up, Isaiah gathered his materials, grateful for the few attendees who approached to thank him quietly. Their support was a small salve against the larger wounds of the evening. As he moved toward the exit, Sheriff Daniels stepped into his path. "Dr. Bennett," Daniels said, his tone even but unmistakably firm, "mind if we have a word?" Isaiah paused, his briefcase in hand. "Of course, Sheriff. What's on your mind?" Daniels tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I've been hearing some concerns from folks around town. They're not sure about this whole healthcare program you're pushing. Seems like a lot of change all at once." Isaiah met his gaze evenly. "Change is often difficult, but it's necessary. The people in this town deserve access to quality healthcare." Daniels chuckled, a low sound that carried little humor. "Maybe, but you've got to understand. Folks here don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and stirring things up. You might want to tread carefully." The implied warning hung in the air. Isaiah felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff. But I'm not here to stir things up. I'm here to help." Daniel's smile was tight, his eyes cold. "Just so we're clear, Doc. We like things the way they are around here. Might be best if you didn't push too hard." Isaiah nodded once, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "Thanks for the advice, Sheriff. I'll keep that in mind." As Daniel stepped aside, Isaiah walked past him and out into the cool night air. The encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, a stark reminder of the barriers he faced, not just in implementing change, but in being seen as someone who belonged in the fight for it. Back in his car, Isaiah gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. He stared out at the dimly lit streets, the frustration and helplessness threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent his entire career fighting for equality, for access, for fairness, yet here he was, once again reduced to defending his right to exist in a space that needed him more than it realized. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was just the beginning, he reminded himself. He had faced worse, and he would face this too. But as he pulled away from the community center, the lingering tension in the pit of his stomach told him that Millbrook's resistance ran deeper than he had anticipated, and that his presence here was about to unearth something far more sinister. Dr. Isaiah Bennett adjusted his tie as he prepared to step into the town hall, the faint chatter from the assembled crowd filtering through the heavy wooden doors. The meeting had been hastily called, ostensibly to discuss the community's response to the healthcare initiative. But Isaiah knew better. Sheriff Daniels and his allies had been sowing seeds of doubt, and this was their stage to let those fears take root in full view of the town. Isaiah was no stranger to these tactics. He had seen them before. An orchestrated show meant to vilify, to discredit, to make the truth harder to discern. He gripped the folder in his hands tighter, filled with data, testimonials, and success stories from other towns where his foundation had made a difference. Facts, he reminded himself, were his greatest ally. But as he entered the hall, he felt the weight of the hostile stares that turned toward him. Daniel stood near the front, flanked by a few town council members. The sheriff wore an expression of smug confidence, a subtle smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Isaiah scanned the room, catching Mitchell's eye. A younger council member who had expressed tentative support for the initiative. Mitchell offered a faint, nervous nod, but quickly looked away. Isaiah took a seat at the front, acutely aware of how the murmurs in the room grew louder. He could make out snippets of conversation, words like outsider, agenda, and trouble. The hostility was palpable, an almost tangible force in the air. The meeting began with the council chair, an older man with a wavering voice, introducing the agenda. But it wasn't long before the conversation took a sharp turn. Sheriff Daniels rose, his presence commanding the room. "Folks," he began, his voice steady and authoritative, "we all want what's best for Millbrook, but we have to ask ourselves, do we really need outsiders coming in and telling us how to run our town?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Daniels continued, his gaze fixed on Isaiah. "Dr. Bennett here has a lot of fancy ideas, but what do we really know about him? About his intentions?" Isaiah stood, his voice calm but firm. "Sheriff Daniels, I appreciate your concerns, but I'm here to address the very real healthcare disparities in this community. The initiative isn't about taking over, it's about providing support where it's needed." Daniels didn't miss a beat. Support or interference? "Because I've been hearing some troubling things, doctor questions about where this funding really comes from, about what kind of people this program will attract." The implication was clear, and Isaiah felt a flicker of anger, but he steadied himself, knowing he couldn't let Daniels bait him. "The funding," Isaiah replied, his tone measured, "comes from legitimate sources, including state grants and private donors. And as for the people this program will serve, they're your neighbors, your friends, your community. This is about providing care for everyone, regardless of their circumstances." Daniel smiled thinly. "Interesting. And how do you respond to allegations that this program might bring unsavory elements into our town, people who don't belong here?" The crowd stirred, and Isaiah felt the walls closing in. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Daniels." Mitchell stood, his voice shaking but resolute. We all know what you're trying to do here. Daniels turned slowly, his expression darkening. Mitchell, I suggest you think carefully about your next words. I'm thinking just fine, Mitchell shot back, though his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. Dr. Bennett's program is exactly what this town needs, and you're trying to turn it into something it's not. The room erupted into chaos, shouts and arguments breaking out as tensions boiled over. Isaiah watched as Daniel's face hardened, his jaw tight. The sheriff raised a hand, and the room gradually fell silent. You're out of line, Mitchell, Daniel said, his tone cold. This isn't about me. It's about protecting this community. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice cutting through the lingering noise. If protecting this community means denying them access to life-saving care, then I question your definition of protection, Sheriff. The two men locked eyes, the air between them charged. For a moment, it seemed the entire room was holding its breath. Then, as if on cue, two uniformed deputies entered the hall. Daniels turned to them, a calculated expression of regret crossing his face. Dr. Bennett, he said, his tone almost apologetic. I'm afraid we've received some concerning reports about your activities. We'll need you to come with us for questioning. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Isaiah stared at Daniels, incredulous. You're arresting me. On what grounds? Daniels spread his hands in mock helplessness. No one said anything about arrest, just some routine questions I'm sure you understand. Isaiah felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain calm. This is nothing more than an intimidation tactic, he said, addressing the room as much as Daniels. And it's not going to work. Daniels' smirk deepened. That's for the investigation to determine. The deputies approached, their hands hovering near their belts. Isaiah glanced at Mitchell, who looked panicked but uncertain of what to do. The rest of the room watched in tense silence, some faces showing unease, others satisfaction. Isaiah raised his hands in a show of compliance. I'll cooperate, he said evenly. But this won't end the way you think it will, Sheriff. As the deputies led him out, Isaiah caught Mitchell's eye once more. Don't let them bury the truth, he said quietly. Mitchell nodded, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. The cold air hit Isaiah as they stepped outside, the crowd's murmurs following him, like an unwanted shadow. As he was placed into the back of the patrol car, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. This was exactly what Daniels wanted. To silence him, to paint him as a problem, rather than a solution. But Isaiah wasn't about to let the sheriff win. As the car pulled away, Isaiah's mind raced. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was personal, and he knew he would have to rely on every ounce of his strength and resilience to fight back. The patrol car hummed steadily as it drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, but inside, the air crackled with tension. Dr. Isaiah Bennett sat rigid in the back seat, his hands resting on his knees, his mind racing through the window. The small-town streetlights blurred past. But Isaiah was acutely aware of the road ahead. He wasn't just being taken in for questioning. This was a calculated move by Sheriff Daniels, a man determined to protect his grip on a system Isaiah was threatening to expose. In the front seat, the two deputies exchanged quiet words. Isaiah couldn't make out their conversation, but their smirks and glances in the rearview mirror spoke volumes. It was a power play, an attempt to rattle him before the real confrontation began. Isaiah, however, refused to be shaken. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a slow, deliberate breath. He reminded himself of the people depending on him, of the lives that could be changed by the initiative he was fighting to bring to Millbrook. As the car slowed, Isaiah recognized the familiar outline of the sheriff's office. The building was modest, almost nondescript, a facade for the deeper corruption that simmered within. The deputies led him inside, the harsh fluorescent lights casting stark shadows on the worn tile floor. Daniels was waiting, leaning against a desk with an air of practiced indifference. His smile was thin and sharp, like a blade barely concealed. Dr. Bennett? Daniels said smoothly, gesturing toward a metal chair in the center of the room. Why don't you take a seat? Let's have a little chat. Isaiah remained standing, meeting Daniels's gaze head-on. This isn't about a chat, Sheriff. It's about intimidation. Daniels chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. Intimidation. No, doctor. This is about accountability. See, when someone comes into my town stirring up trouble, I like to get to the bottom of it. Isaiah crossed his arms, his voice steady. Trouble? You mean providing healthcare to a community that desperately needs it? Daniel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. You can dress it up however you like, but people around here are concerned they've been talking, and it's my job to keep this town safe. Safe for whom? Isaiah shot back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're more interested in preserving your own power than serving this community. The room grew quieter, the tension thick enough to choke on Daniel's jaw tightened, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. You're awfully bold for a man sitting in my station. Isaiah stepped forward, refusing to back down. And you're awfully defensive for someone who claims to be protecting his town. Daniel straightened, his expression hardening. You think you're untouchable, don't you, doctor, coming in here with your fancy degrees and big city money, thinking you can fix everything, but you don't understand how things work around here. Isaiah held his ground. I understand that fear and prejudice are poor substitutes for leadership. Before Daniels could respond, the door to the station swung open. Mitchell stumbled in, his face pale but determined. Sheriff Daniels, he called, his voice trembling but loud enough to command attention. You can't do this. Daniels turned slowly, his expression darkening. Mitchell, you've got no business here. Yes, I do, Mitchell insisted, stepping closer. This isn't right. You can't just drag Dr. Bennett in here because you don't like what he's doing. Daniels's gaze was ice cold. Careful, Mitchell. You're treading on thin ice. But Mitchell pressed on, his voice gaining strength. No, Sheriff, you're the one crossing the line. Everyone in this town knows what you're doing, even if they're too afraid to say it. But I'm not afraid anymore. The room was electric with tension. Isaiah watched the exchange closely, his respect for Mitchell growing with every word. Daniel's authority was slipping, and he knew it. You've got guts, Daniel said finally, his tone laced with menace. But guts won't save you when you're out of a job. Neither will corruption, Mitchell shot back, his voice steady now. Daniels's face twisted in fury, but before he could retaliate, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts and footsteps echoed through the station, drawing everyone's attention. A deputy burst through the door, his face flushed. Sheriff, he panted, there's a crowd gathering outside. They're demanding answers. Daniel's composure cracked for a split second before he regained control. Handle it, he barked. The deputy hesitated, glancing at Isaiah. They're here for Dr. Bennett. Isaiah felt a surge of hope. Word of his detainment had spread, and the community was responding. He turned to Daniels, his voice calm but resolute. You can't silence the truth, Sheriff. Not when people are willing to stand up for it. Daniels glared at him, his fists clenching. We'll see about that. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Isaiah could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that everything was teetering on the edge of an irreversible shift. Daniels was losing control, and the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. Outside, the voices grew louder, more insistent. Mitchell stepped closer to Isaiah, his presence a quiet show of solidarity. This isn't over, Mitchell whispered. We've got people who believe in you, Dr. Bennett. Isaiah nodded, his resolve firm. And I won't let them down. Daniels stormed out of the room, his footsteps heavy with frustration. Isaiah watched him go, knowing the sheriff's next move would be desperate and dangerous. But Isaiah was ready. He had come to Millbrook to make a difference, and he wasn't leaving until the fight was won. Dr. Isaiah Bennett stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, facing the crowd that had grown restless as the evening descended into darkness. The air crackled with anticipation, the low hum of murmurs rising and falling as the townsfolk craned their necks to catch a glimpse of what would unfold. Sheriff Daniels emerged from the courthouse doors, flanked by two deputies. His polished badge gleamed in the dim light, but his face was taut with barely concealed rage. Daniels scanned the crowd, his jaw tightening as he spotted Isaiah standing firm, the picture of calm defiance. You've caused quite the scene, Doctor, Daniels said, his voice loud enough to silence the whispers. Inciting chaos in my town doesn't look good on your clean record. Isaiah stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. Chaos wasn't my doing, Sheriff. This town is waking up, and they're not afraid to ask questions anymore. The only chaos here is the one you've been hiding for years. The crowd stirred. A ripple of agreement passing through Daniel's lips twitched in annoyance, but he kept his tone measured. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? But you don't understand how things work here. We keep order. We protect what's ours. Isaiah tilted his head slightly. By silencing dissent, by targeting the people who challenge you, that's not order, Daniels, that's fear. The words hit their mark. Daniel's composure cracked just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. The crowd grew quieter, sensing the tension building to its peak. You've got a lot of nerve coming here and accusing me, Daniels growled. You don't belong here. You never did. Isaiah's voice cut through the night like a blade. No, Sheriff. What doesn't belong here is your corruption, your abuse of power, and the stranglehold you have on this community. People like you thrive on silence and intimidation, but I'm not silent, and I'm not afraid. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices a rising wave of support. Daniels turned to face them, his face flushed with anger. You people think this man is your savior. He doesn't care about you. He's here for his own gain, to stir up trouble and leave you to deal with the aftermath. Mitchell pushed his way through the crowd, his voice ringing out above the noise. The only troublemaker here is you, Daniels. You've been lining your pockets while this town suffers, we all know it, and we're done being afraid of you. The crowd roared in agreement, their collective voice emboldening Isaiah. He stepped closer to Daniels, his voice steady, but cutting. It's over, Daniels. The lies, the threats, the corruption. It all ends here. Daniels sneered, his mask of authority slipping. You think you can take me down with a few words? I've seen men like you come and go, thinking they can change the world. But this is my town, my rules. Isaiah raised his hand, signaling to someone in the crowd. A young woman stepped forward, holding up her phone. We've been recording everything, Sheriff, she said, her voice trembling but firm. All of it. The threats, the lies. You can't bury the truth anymore. Daniel's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing into a glare. He lunged toward the woman, but Isaiah moved faster, stepping between them. Enough! Isaiah's voice boomed, silencing the crowd. You're done, Daniels. You don't get to hurt anyone else. Daniels froze, his breathing ragged, his fists clenched. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out again. But then another figure emerged from the courthouse, a representative from the state attorney's office, flanked by 2 state troopers. Sheriff Daniels, the representative said, her tone calm but firm. We've received multiple reports about your conduct, and we have enough evidence to warrant an investigation. You're relieved of your duties effective immediately. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, but Daniels wasn't finished. You can't do this, he snarled. I built this town, I protected these people. No, Daniels, Isaiah said, his voice steady. You protected yourself. And now, justice will do what you refuse to. As the state troopers stepped forward to escort Daniels away, he turned to Isaiah, his face a mask of fury. This isn't over, he hissed. You think you've won, but you don't know what you've started. Isaiah held his gaze, unflinching. We've started something you can't stop, the truth will always find a way. Daniels was led away, his protests fading into the night. The crowd surged forward, their cheers and words of gratitude directed at Isaiah. He felt a wave of relief and hope, but he also knew this was just the beginning. The system Daniels represented was still intact, its roots deep and twisted. There was more work to be done, more battles to fight. Mitchell stepped up beside him, a determined glint in his eye. What now, Doc? Isaiah looked out at the crowd, their faces illuminated with hope and determination. Now, he said, we keep going, we hold everyone accountable, and we rebuild together. The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices carrying into the night. Isaiah knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt the weight of possibility. He had taken a stand, and the people of Millbrook had stood with him together. They would face whatever came next. Isaiah Bennett stood under the dim lights of the Millbrook Town Hall, the tension in the room suffocating. The faint hum of the overhead bulbs did little to mask the charged silence as he faced Sheriff Daniels. They stood at opposite ends of the room, separated by the dark wood of a long table that seemed to represent the vast chasm between their principles. Daniels leaned back in his chair, his smug confidence etched into every line of his face. "So, here we are," he drawled, fingers tapping a rhythm on the table. "The great Dr. Bennett, thinking he can walk into my town and play hero." Isaiah's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. "This isn't your town, Daniels. It belongs to the people you've been exploiting, threatening, and silencing for years." Daniels smirked. "Exploiting, silencing, big words for a man who doesn't know how things work around here. You think you're the first outsider to waltz in and cry foul, you'll be gone by next week, and I'll still be here." Isaiah didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment, steeling himself against the sheriff's taunts. "The difference this time," Isaiah said, his voice calm but firm, "is that I'm not leaving until the truth comes out." Daniels laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Truth. The only truth is what I say it is. People around here know better than to cross me. They understand order, discipline, something you clearly don't." Isaiah stepped forward, placing his hands on the table. "Order, discipline. You mean fear. You've built your power by keeping this town scared and silent, but not anymore." Before Daniels could respond, the door behind Isaiah creaked open, and Mitchell entered, holding a laptop. He looked nervous but resolute as he set the device on the table. "I think it's time we show everyone what you've been up to, Daniels," Mitchell said, glancing at Isaiah for reassurance. Daniels' eyes flicked to the laptop, his jaw tightening. "What's this supposed to be, some amateur detective work?" Isaiah gestured to Mitchell, who began typing. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of files. "These," Isaiah said, pointing to the screen, "are records of your activities. Unauthorized asset seizures, falsified arrest reports, and payouts from shady deals with people who thrive on the chaos you create." The color drained from Daniel's face, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward with a sneer. "That's nonsense fabrications. You don't have a shred of real evidence." Mitchell clicked on a video file, and the room filled with the grainy but unmistakable footage of Daniels, in a dimly lit parking lot, exchanging a briefcase with a known local criminal. The timestamp and location were clearly visible, leaving no room for doubt. The sheriff's composure cracked. He slammed his fist on the table, rising to his feet. "You have no right to—" Isaiah cut him off. "No right. These are your actions, Daniels, your choices, and now the people of this town will know the truth." Daniels' expression twisted into a snarl. "You think this is enough to take me down? I have connections, allies who won't let this go anywhere." Isaiah stepped closer, his voice low but full of resolve. "Then let's test that theory, because this footage, these documents, they're already being sent to the state attorney's office. By now, they've seen enough to launch a full investigation." Daniels froze, his bravado faltering as the weight of Isaiah's words sank in. The room seemed to hold its breath as the sheriff's mask of control crumbled. "You don't know who you're messing with," he hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Isaiah shot back. "A man who thought he could bury the truth forever, but you underestimated the people you've oppressed. They're done being afraid." As if on cue, the sound of voices filtered in from outside. The townsfolk had gathered, their murmurs growing louder as they waited for answers. The weight of the moment pressed down on Daniels, his gaze darting toward the door. The sheriff's hand moved to his belt, his fingers brushing the holster of his gun. Isaiah tensed, his eyes narrowing. "Don't," he warned, his voice sharp. "If you think violence is your way out of this, you're even more delusional than I thought." Daniels hesitated, his hand hovering over the weapon. Mitchell took a step back, his fear evident. But Isaiah held his ground, his gaze locked on Daniels. "You've lost, Daniels," Isaiah said. "The people outside, the evidence we've collected, it's over." Daniels let out a ragged breath, his hand falling away from the gun. For the first time, he looked truly defeated, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his downfall, but his eyes still burned with defiance. "You think you're a hero," he spat. "But this town will eat you alive, you'll see." Isaiah didn't waver. "I'm not here to be a hero, I'm here to make sure people like you can't hurt anyone else." The door burst open again, this time admitting 2 state troopers. They strode into the room, their expressions stern. "Sheriff Daniels, one of them said. "You're under arrest for corruption, evidence tampering, and abuse of power." Daniels glared at Isaiah as the troopers stepped forward, his hands clenching into fists. "This isn't over," he growled as they cuffed him. Isaiah watched silently as Daniels was led out of the room, his threats echoing in the hallway. Mitchell let out a shaky breath, his shoulders relaxing. "We did it," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. Isaiah nodded, but his expression remained somber. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The system that let Daniels thrive is still in place. We have to keep fighting." As they stepped outside, the crowd erupted into cheers. Their voices filling the night, Isaiah raised a hand to quiet them, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the battles yet to come. But for now, the people of Millbrook had taken their first step toward reclaiming their town. The courtroom was silent as the judge's gavel fell, signaling the end of an era in Millbrook. Sheriff Daniels, once a figure of unchecked authority, now stood before the assembled crowd in handcuffs, flanked by state troopers. The air was heavy with the weight of long-awaited justice, a blend of disbelief and vindication hanging over the townspeople who had gathered to witness the fall of their oppressor. Isaiah Bennett watched from the gallery, his hands resting on the edge of the wooden bench. His suit, now wrinkled from a long day of hearings and testimony, bore the marks of his relentless fight. Despite the exhaustion that tugged at him, his shoulders were square, his expression calm, yet resolute. He had done what he set out to do. Daniel's sentencing had been swift and decisive. The overwhelming evidence, from the damning video footage to the financial records meticulously gathered by Isaiah and Mitchell, painted a picture that even the most skilled defense attorney couldn't refute. As the judge read the charges aloud, corruption, evidence tampering, and abuse of power, Daniel's once smug demeanor crumbled. His defiance had turned into desperation, his threats into hollow echoes. For the people of Millbrook, Daniel's arrest was more than a moment of accountability. It was the first crack in a long-standing wall of fear and silence. As the court adjourned, murmurs of hope rippled through the crowd. Isaiah caught sight of familiar faces, community members who had been too afraid to speak out before now. Their eyes carried a spark of determination. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, cameras flashing as reporters called out questions. Isaiah stepped into the chaos, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the gathered journalists. "This isn't just about one man," he said, glancing toward the courthouse steps where Daniels was being led away. "It's about a system that allowed corruption to thrive. Today is a step forward, but the work isn't finished. Millbrook deserves better, and we're going to make sure it happens." In the days following the trial, Isaiah found himself reflecting on his journey. The ordeal had pushed him to his limits, forcing him to confront not only Daniels, but also his own doubts. There were moments he had questioned whether justice could truly prevail, whether the weight of the system was too much to bear. But through it all, he had learned the value of persistence, the strength in standing firm, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Isaiah's perspective on power had shifted as well. He had always known the importance of using his influence for good, but this experience had deepened his resolve. It wasn't enough to succeed in his personal endeavors. He had a responsibility to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The humility that had once defined him now carried a sharper edge, a quiet determination to be a voice for change. The fallout from Daniel's arrest rippled through Millbrook and beyond. The state attorney general's office launched a full investigation into the town's law enforcement practices, uncovering years of misconduct that extended far beyond Daniels. Several officers resigned or faced disciplinary action as the extent of the corruption came to light. In response, a coalition of community leaders and activists formed a task force to advocate for police reform. Isaiah was invited to join as an advisor, his expertise and experience making him a natural fit. Together, they worked to implement changes, from introducing body cameras to establishing an independent oversight board. The process was slow and met with resistance, but progress was undeniable. For the people of Millbrook, the shift was palpable. Neighbors who once avoided each other out of fear now gathered to discuss the future of their town. Protests turned into town hall meetings, anger into action. A new police chief was appointed, someone with a reputation for integrity and a commitment to rebuilding trust. Isaiah sat on the porch of his childhood home, the sun setting over the familiar streets of Millbrook. His mother joined him, a warm mug of tea in her hands. She didn't say much, but her smile spoke volumes. For the first time in years, the town felt like a place of possibility, not despair. "You did good, son," she said quietly, her voice tinged with pride. "You've given this place something it hasn't had in a long time, hope." Isaiah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone who stood up, who refused to back down. I just helped them see they had the power all along." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of the past weeks slowly lifting. For Isaiah, the moment was bittersweet. While he felt a sense of accomplishment, he couldn't ignore the lingering challenges. Millbrook's transformation was far from complete, and there were still battles to be fought. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Isaiah's phone buzzed. It was a message from Mitchell, detailing the latest developments in the task force's initiatives. Isaiah smiled, typing a quick response before setting the phone aside. There was much to do, but he was ready. His thoughts turned to the broader implications of his work. Millbrook was just one town, but its story resonated with communities across the country. Isaiah had received messages from people in other small towns, inspired by what had happened, eager to bring similar change to their own communities. He knew he couldn't be everywhere at once, but he could be a catalyst, a spark, for something larger. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, his mother's presence a comforting anchor. As he closed his eyes, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he could rest, knowing that the truth had prevailed and that the seeds of justice had been planted. Isaiah Bennett stood at the edge of the Millbrook Community Center, the murmurs of gathered townsfolk echoing around him. The center was filled with people, neighbors, activists, and leaders who had come together not just to celebrate a victory, but to plan for the road ahead. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries hung in the air, mingling with the electric buzz of hope and determination. Isaiah watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy, but full. It had been weeks since the courtroom showdown that had brought Sheriff Daniels to justice. The revelations of systemic corruption and abuse had rocked Millbrook to its core, yet instead of succumbing to despair, the community had risen with newfound strength. This was no longer a town shackled by fear, it was a town ready to fight for its future. For Isaiah, the journey had been transformative. He had always known the weight of responsibility that came with his position as a corporate leader, but this experience had taught him the true depth of his resilience. He had faced systemic bias head-on, enduring public humiliation and personal attacks, yet he had never wavered in his pursuit of justice. Isaiah's humility, once a quiet strength, had evolved into a powerful resolve. He no longer saw himself merely as an individual fighting for his own rights. He understood the importance of using his platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. The ordeal had forced him to confront his own doubts and fears, strengthening his belief that real change required both courage and collaboration. As he stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room, Isaiah looked out at the faces of his neighbors. Many of them had suffered under Daniel's regime, yet they stood before him now, united and determined. Isaiah cleared his throat, the room falling silent as he began to speak. "What happened in Millbrook isn't unique," he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "It's a symptom of a much larger problem. A system that, for too long, has allowed corruption and prejudice to thrive. But what we've shown here is that change is possible. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's possible." Isaiah paused, letting his words sink in. He knew the struggle they had faced in Millbrook was one shared by countless communities across the country. The systemic racism and abuse of power that Daniels had embodied were not isolated to their small town. They were woven into the fabric of a larger, deeply flawed system. "But this isn't just about tearing down what's broken," he continued. "It's about building something better. It's about holding each other accountable, lifting each other up, and making sure that justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." The crowd nodded in agreement, their faces a mix of resolve and reflection. Isaiah's words carried the weight of experience, but they also carried hope. A reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, progress was within reach. Isaiah's story had become a symbol for others. a beacon of resilience and determination. News of his fight had spread far beyond Millbrook, inspiring conversations about police reform, accountability, and systemic injustice. Civic groups in neighboring towns had reached out for guidance, eager to replicate Millbrook's progress. For Isaiah, the most powerful moments came from the personal messages he received. Letters from individuals who had faced similar struggles, families who had lost loved ones to corrupt systems, young people who saw in him a reason to believe that they could make a difference. Each message reminded him of the ripple effect of his actions, of the lives touched by his decision to stand up and fight. "I'm not a hero," Isaiah told the crowd. "I'm just one man who believed that we deserved better, but together, we're unstoppable. Together, we can make sure that what happened here doesn't happen again. Not in Millbrook, not anywhere." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Isaiah barely registered it. His mind was already on the next steps: the meetings with activists, the workshops on systemic reform, the late-night phone calls with community leaders across the state. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, he felt a deep sense of peace. As the event wound down, Isaiah stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The stars above Millbrook were unusually bright, a reminder of the beauty and possibility that lay ahead. He thought about the people who had stood beside him: Mitchell, whose quiet determination had been a steady anchor; his mother, whose unwavering support had been his foundation; the townsfolk, who had found their voices after years of silence. Isaiah knew the journey hadn't just changed Millbrook, it had changed him. He had seen the worst of what power could do, but he had also seen the best of what people could become when they refused to back down. The fight for justice had taught him that resilience wasn't about never falling. It was about rising every time you did. As he walked down the quiet street, Isaiah thought about the next generation, the children growing up in a town that no longer feared its own protectors. He thought about the lessons they would learn, the courage they would carry forward, the changes they would demand. And he smiled, knowing that the seeds of a brighter future had been planted. To those watching Isaiah's story unfold, the message was clear. Injustice thrives in silence, but change begins with a single voice. Whether it was standing up to corruption, challenging systemic biases, or simply refusing to accept the status quo, everyone had a role to play. Isaiah's journey was far from over, but it had become a testament to the power of resilience and collective action. It was a reminder that, while the road to justice might be long and difficult, it was a road worth traveling, and one that could change the world. As the lights dimmed in Millbrook, and the town settled into a quiet stillness, Isaiah looked back at the community center one last time. Inside, the voices of neighbors and friends mingled, carrying the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And for the first time in a long time, Isaiah felt truly at peace. At